In the spring of 1917, field hospitals along the Western Front were overwhelmed. The fighting near Arras had turned quiet villages into corridors of pain. Wooden huts served as makeshift wards. The air smelled of iodine, smoke, and earth. Among the medical staff was a young nurse whose name survives only in a few faded records. She had come from the South, trained hastily in a converted convent before being sent to the front. The clearing station where she worked was little more than a cluster of canvas tents beside a shell-torn orchard. Stretcher bearers arrived hourly, bringing the wounded from the forward trenches. Most were beyond saving. There was no time for sentiment. Dressings, morphine, and water, that was a routine. Yet within the chaos, the nurses developed a rhythm, a quiet efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. She moved among them silently, her uniform stained and her hands raw from washing bandages. In her pocket, she carried a small notebook, a habit from training. When a man was dying and asked to send a message home, she wrote his words there, names, towns, fragments of sentences that ended in pain. Most of those notes were never delivered. On one evening, as artillery echoed faintly across the fields, an orderly called her to a stretcher. "He won't last long," he said. The soldier was young, barely 20. His tunic had been cut away, revealing a wound too deep to treat. His eyes moved weakly, searching for someone who could listen. The nurse knelt beside him, pencil ready. He tried to speak, but no sound came. She held his hand and waited. Finally, he whispered a few words, halting, urgent. She leaned closer, wrote them down carefully, and promised she would see them delivered. He nodded once, exhaled softly, and was still. Outside, the guns began again. Inside, the nurse tore a strip of gauze, wrapped it around the notebook, and slipped it into her coat. The promise had been made. By morning, the clearing station was crowded again. Rain had turned the yard into a sea of mud. The nurses moved between cots, their aprons streaked with red and brown. Exhaustion had become routine. They worked until they could no longer stand, slept where they fell, then began again. In the corner of the ward, the nurse sat briefly at a wooden table, her notebook open. Between pages of smudged graphite, one entry stood out. "Tell her I kept it with me. Tell her not to wait." It was signed only with the first name, Thomas. She checked the tag from his tunic. PT, T, Hale, 2nd Battalion, East Surrey Regiment. The rest of his effects fit into a small linen bag. A watch, a worn photograph, and a broken rosary. She recorded the details in a register, as regulations required. Each death had its paperwork. But something in the soldier's words unsettled her. The way he had clung to them. The quiet fear that she might forget. She had seen hundreds die, yet few seemed to fear death itself. Most feared being forgotten. That night, when the last stretcher was cleared, she took the notebook from her pocket and read the line again by lantern light. Tell her not to wait. She wondered who the message was meant for, a mother, a wife, or someone he loved before the war. There was no address, no letter, only those 7 words and a promise spoken in the dark. She could have left it at that. Many did. But war leaves little room for mercy, and even less for promises. Still, she tore a page from her notebook, folded it carefully, and placed it with the soldier's effects. For delivery, she wrote on the tag. Outside, the guns continued to sound across the horizon, not with fury, but with the dull persistence of rain. In that rhythm, she found something like resolve. The promise was now a duty, and duty was something she understood. Artist palette image prompt for AI generation. WW1 Field Hospital interior. Nurse writing in a small notebook by lantern light beside a cot. Rain outside the tent. Vintage realism, muted colors, somber tone. 2 days later, orders came to evacuate the clearing station. The line was shifting again, and the wounded who could be moved were sent rearward by convoy. The nurse was assigned to accompany one of the lorries bound for a base hospital near Amiens. The vehicle was a flatbed truck, its sides covered with tarpaulin, stacked with stretchers and supply crates. Before departure, she checked the ledger one last time. Private Thomas Hale's name was marked deceased. His effects, tagged and sealed, were placed among dozens of others in a wooden crate marked personal property. She slipped a folded page with his words inside the bag, beneath the photograph and rosary. It was a small act, unnoticed by anyone else. The journey took most of the night. The roads were churned with ruts, lit only by dim headlights and the glow of distant flares. Occasionally, the convoy stopped as artillery rumbled in the distance. The nurses huddled in their coats, listening to the rain on the canvas, the faint groans of the wounded behind them. Somewhere past Albert, a shell fell close enough to shake the truck. Mud and stone rained down. One of the drivers cursed, then laughed nervously. The nurse said nothing. She only pressed her hand against the pocket where her notebook rested, the one that still held the record of her promise. By dawn, they reached the base hospital. Rows of white tents stood in the mist, their order a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind. The dead were taken to a separate tent for identification and cataloging. The nurse followed briefly, watching as clerks wrote names, regiments, and numbers into ledgers. She handed over the sealed bag of effects. Regulations were clear. Once delivered, personal items were to be processed and sent to the records office in London. But as she turned to leave, she hesitated, just long enough to whisper, "Please let it reach her." Outside, the sun was rising weakly through the fog. The war continued somewhere beyond the hills, but for the nurse, the line between duty and promise had already blurred. By summer 1917, the base hospital had stabilized into routine. Ambulances arrived daily, delivering the wounded from Arras and Ypres. Behind the wards, a smaller tent held a different kind of work, the records office. Here, rows of clerks sat at wooden tables, sorting effects from the dead. Each bag was opened, cataloged, and assigned a number before being sent to the Central Effects Depot in London. The nurse visited often, sometimes under the pretext of checking supply inventories. In truth, she wanted to be certain that Private Thomas Hale's belongings had not been lost among the thousands of similar parcels. The clerk, a weary man with ink-stained cuffs, found the entry without looking up. "Hale, Thomas, East Surrey. Effects received, forwarded June 12th. She nodded. That was all she could do. But something in her expression must have caught his attention. "You knew him?" he asked. "Only briefly," she replied. "He asked me to deliver a message." The clerk gave a small, sympathetic shrug. "Best you can hope is that it reaches a family. Things get misplaced." He gestured toward a shelf where unclaimed parcels gathered dust. Sometimes they never do. That night, in her tent, she took out her notebook and copied the soldier's words onto a clean page. "Tell her I kept it with me. Tell her not to wait." She tore the page neatly, folded it, and slipped it into an envelope addressed only to the family of P.T. Thomas Hale, East Surrey Regiment. It was not procedure, but she sent it with the hospital's outgoing post anyway. Regulations could be bent in small ways. The war had already broken far greater things. Weeks passed with no reply. The nurse continued her work, dressing wounds, writing names, and listening to the endless hum of the war around her. Yet sometimes, when she looked toward the mailroom tent, she imagined a letter traveling through the system, carried by trains, ships, and sorting rooms, a message moving slowly homeward, guided only by a promise. Autumn came early that year. The fields around the base hospital turned gray, and the smell of smoke carried on every wind. The wounded now arrived from Passchendaele. Men caked in mud so thick that even their dog tags were unreadable. In the quiet hours between convoys, the nurse sorted supplies in the dispensary, her thoughts rarely leaving the small letter she had sent months before. One morning, the post corporal entered the tent with a bundle of returned mail. "Undeliverable," he said simply, dropping them onto the table. Among the envelopes lay hers, the one marked the family of P.T. Thomas Hale. The seal was unbroken. A red stamp across the front read, "No known address." She turned it over in her hands, studying the creases left by its long journey. The paper smelled faintly of dust and coal. It had traveled hundreds of miles only to return to the place it began. Later that day, she visited the records office once more. The same clerk checked the registry, scanning rows of names and notes. "Hail, Thomas," he read aloud. "Family notified, no next of kin listed. Possibly transferred from a factory district near Guilford. But those files were lost in the last shelling." The nurse said nothing. There was nothing to say. She took the envelope back to her tent and opened it. The single line stared up at her. "Tell her I kept it with me. Tell her not to wait." She folded it again and slipped it into her notebook, alongside other entries written for other men. That night, rain beat against the canvas roof. The nurse lay awake, listening to the endless rhythm of water and distant guns. Somewhere far from the front, families were receiving official telegrams. Neat sentences beginning with "The War Office regrets to inform you," yet she knew that for many, no letter would ever come. The next morning, she wrote one more line beneath the soldier's message: "Delivered but not received." Then she closed the book and returned to her work. By the winter of 1918, the front had begun to change. Rumors of peace passed through the wards like whispers, uncertain, fragile, impossible to believe. Casualties still arrived daily, but there was a difference in the air, a sense that the endless tide might finally turn. The nurse received new orders. She was to return to England with a group of medical personnel being rotated for rest and reassignment. After more than a year near the front, she packed what little she owned, her uniform, her field kit, and the notebook she kept close to her heart. The convoy left before dawn. As their train rolled through the shattered countryside, she looked out at the ruined villages, the broken trees, and the fields still scarred with shell holes. Once, these had been names on maps. Now they were just silence. In her satchel, between official papers, she carried the folded letter, the family of PD. Thomas Hale. She couldn't bring herself to discard it. It had outlasted everything: the fighting, the hospitals, even the address it was meant for. At the port, the nurses boarded a hospital ship bound for Southampton. The sea was calm, the horizon gray. She stood on deck with the wind in her hair, watching the coastline fade behind her. Around her, men limped on crutches or lay quietly under blankets, eyes fixed on home. In the ward below, she checked on them as she always had, efficiently, without words of comfort she no longer believed in. When one young orderly noticed a worn letter tucked in her apron, he asked, "Still writing to the boys?" "Just keeping a promise," she said simply. He nodded, not understanding, and went back to his duties. When they reached England, the nurses disembarked to the sound of gulls and church bells. The nurse paused at the end of the pier, holding the letter one last time. She didn't open it. She only whispered, "You've come home after all," before tucking it away again. After several weeks of processing and rest, the nurse was stationed at a convalescent hospital in southern England. The war had ended, though the wards were still full. Men returned with wounds that would never heal, some visible, others buried too deep to name. During her first leave, she took the train north toward Surrey. She had written to the records office again, asking for any trace of Private Thomas Hale's family. The reply was brief. Possible address: Street John's Cottages, Guilford. No confirmation. It was enough. The train rattled through the countryside, past hedgerows and villages untouched by the front. Everything looked impossibly clean: gardens, shops, children playing in fields. The nurse carried with her the envelope, now softened by time and handling. Inside was the note she had written in that dim hospital tent. "Tell her I kept it with me. Tell her not to wait." In Guilford, she walked the muddy lane to St. John's Cottages. At the last door, an elderly woman stood feeding chickens. Her clothes were plain. Her face bore the calm of someone who had waited a long time. The nurse introduced herself, explaining she had served with the Medical Corps in France. When she spoke the name Thomas Hale, the woman's hand stopped moving. "Yes," she said after a moment. "My son. We never heard, nothing certain." The nurse reached into her coat and held out the envelope. "He asked me to deliver this. I tried before. It came back." The woman took it gently. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat on the small bench by the door and looked toward the fields. The nurse waited beside her, saying nothing. After a long silence, the woman nodded once, still holding the letter. "Thank you," she said. "That's more than we had." The nurse left soon after, walking back down the lane as the church bells began to ring across the valley. In her pocket, the space where the letter had been felt suddenly light, as if a weight, long carried, had finally been set down. Years later, long after the war had ended, the nurse's notebook was found among a collection of personal effects stored in a hospital archive. Its cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed, the handwriting small and deliberate. Each page recorded the same pattern: a date, a name, a few words spoken in pain or fear, and a single line at the end: "Promise kept." There were dozens of entries. Many were brief, a sentence or two. Others filled whole pages. Some bore names now lost to history, others only numbers. The last entry in the book read, simply, "PT, Thomas Hale, East Surrey Rate. Tell her I kept it with me. Tell her not to wait." Beneath it, in the nurse's hand, was written, "Delivered." The notebook became part of the hospital's war collection, stored with letters, medals, and uniforms. Curators later noted that, unlike most wartime journals, it contained no mention of battles, no personal reflections, only the final word of others. It was, as one historian wrote, a quiet record of compassion amid destruction. The nurse's name appeared only once, faintly, on the inside cover: Yem, Queen Alexander's Imperial Nursing Service. No other trace of her survived. Visitors who came to the museum decades later often paused at the display. The notebook sat open under glass, beside a faded envelope addressed to the family of P.T. Thomas Hale. The ink had bled slightly with time, but the words were still legible. No narration was needed. The pages spoke for themselves, a record of promises made by one woman to men who would never return. And in that silence, time held still, not in defiance of war, but as remembrance of what humanity endures, even when surrounded by its own undoing.